Hello and welcome to the Estee Show. Today is one of those off topics that has less to do with product management and more of an issue that I care deeply about. We're discussing how universities became such a hotbed of anti-Semitism over the past year with Shai Goldman. Shai Goldman is a software engineer. He graduated from Columbia University this past spring and witnessed the protests calling for the genocide of Jews firsthand. He wrote an article in Tablet magazine called The Tale of Two Academies, where he compares studying in Columbia University against studying at a religious institution. I recommend you read the article, and I'll include a link in the show notes. But his description of how strong the sense of shame is at the privilege, everything Western, at the Ivy League universities touches on something deeper that I think explains where the anti-Semitism took root and why it's okay to hate certain groups of people. It isn't okay to hate on other groups of people. If you're Jewish, this past year has been really difficult. It has been scary for those who have ancestors who have gone through the Holocaust, for people who grew up with either experiencing anti-Semitism in other countries or just knowing the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, but always having a belief that America was a country, a different kind of country, a good kind of country, where anyone can practice their religion freely and safely. And the protests that have just been picking up steam over the last year and not slowing down have done nothing to quiet those fears. Regardless of how you voted in this election or of who you hoped you would win, and I know I have listeners on both sides of the aisle, the past administration did not do enough to slow down this growth of anti-Semitism. And this administration that has been voted in promises to do something about it. In fact, Elise Stefanik, the rock star congresswoman who went viral for cross-examining the university presidents and exposing the deep-rooted hypocrisy, she has just been appointed to serve as UN ambassador. And I'm hopeful about a return to an America where people of all religions are free to practice in safety. In fact, let's dedicate this episode to her and wish her lots of luck in her new role. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Share it with a friend. Let's get started.
And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
What's the context? I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric, when it
and is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric, when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
Shai, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
So the topic we're going to discuss today is a little bit different for my audience because it's not about product management, even though you are in the world of tech. But it's more around what's happening on college campuses and what kind of environment led to the behaviors we started seeing in the fall of last year, all the way through current date. So just to set it up, after October 7th, I think to the shock of many Jewish students, but I wasn't a student. I'm many years out of any kind of institution. The protests with chants of globalize the Intifada, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, chants that are essentially calling for the physical murder of Jews were being chanted. And to the shock of, I think, everyone, Congress called a hearing with Claudine Gay, then the president of Harvard University, the president of Penn, the president of MIT. And the question was, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate your school's policies? And the answer that I think shocked the world was it depends on the context.
Right.
So it was a multi-month process, a battle on social media. Claudine Gay and the president of Penn resigned, but the president of MIT is still there. And the question is...
Who's Jewish, by the way. I think that's a part of it.
Nikki Kornbluth?
Yeah. Being Jewish does not make you immune from these problems.
Self-hating Jewish syndrome?
Yeah. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No. So the question people have is like, clearly we're living in a different world. Clearly what seems obvious to people on the outside does not seem obvious to people inside of the universities. And what are they teaching? What are they reading? What is the attitude that leads to the normalization of this kind of behavior? And you wrote a very interesting article in Tablet Magazine where you compared studying at Columbia, which you graduated from last year, to studying in an Orthodox yeshiva in Gush. And you just juxtaposed the two. And I thought it was a very interesting insight into why these schools reject the Jew. So I want to give the floor over to you to sort of explain your theory.
Yeah. So, this article, just to tell the background of why I wrote this article, I had a couple months in between graduating college and before I started my first job. So I kind of just wanted to sit down and make sense of what just happened. The last year of college was so nuts with all the anti-Semitism coming up around me. So I kind of just wanted to make sense of it. And what I realized as I was writing was I didn't really think this was just an anti-Semitism problem. I concluded that I think that there's a lot of rot in these institutions, to the core. And the anti-Semitism is just one symptom of that. And this idea of comparing the college to the yeshiva came to mind because in yeshiva, I really felt like I had a successful educational experience where people were really invested in what we were learning. The teachers were really excited about it. And they really believed in the mission of the institution of higher learning. Whereas what I thought I was seeing actually when I looked back at it at Columbia was an institution which was not succeeding in getting its students excited about what they're learning. It's not instilling pride and Columbia is supposed to be teaching the Western canon, right? It's got this whole core curriculum program, which basically means every student's supposed to study the fundamentals of literature. Even if you're a math major, you need to read all of Homer or whatever to Shakespeare, etc. And you need to study the fundamentals of philosophy. That's the core curriculum. They want to instill the values of Western civilization into their students officially. So it's very similar in yeshiva. They want to teach everybody the values of Torah. But the difference is in the yeshiva, the professors actually believe in that mission. Whereas what I was experiencing at Columbia was that they were actually ashamed of their tradition and their legacy. And they would say things, we'd study Shakespeare. Well, actually, Shakespeare might have been a little bit of a misogynist, stuff like that. You're reading about, or when we this was in an art class, actually, we looked at the Parthenon, which is in Athens. It's that very old temple to Athena. But it's used a lot as a symbol of democracy because Athens was the place of democracy. So when we were learning about that, my professor made a comment by the way, in Athens, they didn't really have democracy because after all, the slaves were the ones that built the Parthenon. And then that's good and important, but it was just every time they were always focused on the negatives of what they were teaching us, as opposed to focusing on the positives, which is at yeshiva.
I just want to drill down on one thing there, because in the Jewish world also, we also say no one's perfect, and King David, he had sins. So what's the difference between saying Shakespeare was a misogynist? Do we then reject his literature? If we say Athens wasn't a true democracy, do we then say we are upset we came from Greece? What's the next step? How does that embarrassment manifest itself?
Yeah, so for me, it's really kind of what do you emphasize and what do you focus on? When we say in Judaism, King David sinned or whatever, or when we discuss topics that there are places in the Gemara where it seems like women aren't being treated equally. That's always being, taken in the tone of this is a potential problem. It's something that we should deal with. But at the end of the day, we love the Gemara and we think King David was a righteous person. And our goal is for you to, to aspire to be like King David in the ways that he was good. Our goal is for you to love the Gemara and to think that the rabbis who wrote it were righteous. That's always clear and in mind. Whereas what it felt like sometimes was happening in my classes was the goal was not to say, oh, this is a problem that needs to be dealt with, but the goal was to say, actually, this stuff is just bad. And it's ironic because a lot of these professors, this is their whole job, is to study this stuff, and they do love it in a certain way, but they're just so focused on constantly drilling down on the negatives. And what happens is that the students aren't actually interested in learning it because they just think, why should I want to learn this? It's, it's all, so negative. We want to, everything, we're so much better than them. So why should we respect their ideas? Why should we respect what they say?
And does that come with an attitude of burn it down? Moving into the more, what has this anti-Semitism and what you're calling anti-Westernism formed to of, we shouldn't respect the British Empire because it was the most colonialist nation. And it turns into we're embarrassed of our roots. But it's funny to me because those institutions pride themselves on being so difficult to get into, so elitist. Like if you choose one place in the United States that sort of represents, quote unquote, the elite colonialism, that is those institutions. And then they're sort of, what's tuition, $100,000 a year? And then they're the ones, screaming, quote unquote, give equality, and help the poor people, when it's the furthest from where those universities are.
Yeah, I think people were making some jokes about the encampments that they were getting catered or something into their encampments from these very expensive places to get their coffee or whatever in the morning. I think so. This is an interesting question, which is, so fine. Let's say they're being taught to be ashamed of Western culture, and they're being taught that America is the worst, or they're being taught that Colombia is the worst. There's this very funny focus on how you're I went to Colombia. So Colombia, one of the things that Colombia has done, which is a big crime, is it's gentrified a lot of the area around Colombia. It used to be a very dangerous place. It used to be much cheaper to live there, and now a lot of the areas around Colombia and more have been gentrified. So people get very upset about it, and they but on the one hand, they want to burn Colombia down. On the other hand, I think it's a lot more convenient for them to sort of just find some other problem which won't impact them as directly and put their passions into that. So I think that might be where the anti-Semitism thing comes in. If I can get the Jews kicked out of Israel because they're colonialists, then I can feel good about myself, even though I am a colonialist living in Native American land and I didn't give up my house. But at least I was doing, I was getting rid of the colonialist thing somewhere else. And it's not my problem. It's literally the scapegoat, put your sins onto this goat and push him off the cliff. So that way I don't have to get pushed off the cliff myself.
So let's talk about what's acceptable to say. So is it acceptable to say America is the worst? And is that an acceptable thing to hear from a professor?
So it's usually more subtle than that, I would say. If a professor said America is the worst, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised, but that's not something that I heard. It's more things well, America has oppressed a lot of peoples, or America has caused a lot of wars around the world. You don't just blurt it out and say that. And a lot of times you are ignoring kind of the problems in the rest of the world. We did a unit, I think it was on the colonialization of the Americas in my philosophy class. And we had this text which was describing the Aztec customs, which include very brutal human sacrifice. But in our discussion of the text, which I was surprised that it was even in the text, but it was a primary source. We only talked pretty much, as far as I remember, in class about the stuff that the colonialists did, which was, evil and bad, granted, against the
Aztecs,
the native peoples. And we kind of just brushed over that whole section where it described all this brutalization that was being done by the Aztecs on their own people. So I don't think it was going out there and saying it, but a lot. It's kind of this undertone which you can detect through that exists throughout everything that they're saying. There's a subtext that America is bad, and we've had a net negative impact on the world, and not just America, but Europe as well. Yeah.
And I feel like if you carry, that's very interesting, but if you carry that historic analysis of only focusing on the fact that America, quote unquote, occupied the lands and not focusing on the fact that they were murdering and burning their children in public ceremonies, if you look at the judgment on sort of Israel and Gaza, and the whole Queer for Gaza movement, when queer people in Gaza get tortured and thrown off roofs, and women have no rights at all, and that's not a discussion at all. The only discussion is the fact that Israel is occupying, quote unquote, Gaza. So what I want to get to is like, okay, so studying history is one thing. And saying, okay, it's very indicative, it's very telling. But at which point does it become okay to say to your, there are a lot of Israeli students in Columbia. On our last podcast was an Israeli grad from Columbia. At which point is it okay to say, I want this person killed? Scott Galloway, who's a professor of mine at NYU, he made a point saying, had it been any other group, homosexuals, African Americans, and people would be chanting on campus saying, kill, I don't even want to say it out loud, but any one of those groups of people, like that would be completely unacceptable. Immediate expulsion, involvement of the feds. And somehow when it comes to the Jews, it depends on the context. Why is there that normalization now? And is there a difference at the professor level, at that expert, quote unquote, level versus student to student level?
Yeah. Why is this being tolerated? Why aren't these people being thrown out of school, right? They're getting out there every day. I mean, it's not just that they're doing these anti-Semitic things, which is, a problem, but they're also disrupting all of campus life. Like, even if they were just like chanting about something random with like all this passion, and like they're blocking streets and like breaking campus rules every day, like even if it wasn't anti-Semitic, you would expect there would be some disciplinary consequences for their actions, and there isn't any. I think that it's possible, and I think we have some evidence of this, that the administration actually agrees with everything that these protesters are saying, and that's why they're not taking any action, because they're not going to go out there and protest themselves. That would be too scandalous. And some professors do. By the way, the head of Lit Hum, who's also Jewish, as we mentioned, Howley, he was out there with the protesters at some point. Lit Hum is the main literature. He wasn't my professor, but he's the one who's in charge of the curriculum. But they've changed the curriculum a lot since I was there. They took out some of my favorites.
And what's with him
I think
now?
that the administrators...
Is he still a professor there?
Yeah, he's still the... he's not just a professor, he's the head of literature humanities, which is a pretty important role. Like, he's like, I don't know exactly. I mean, there's like a whole committee, but like he's like listed at the top. So he like probably makes the last decisions on what goes on the syllabus, etc. His profile picture on X is him like doing some like protest or something. I looked him up once in a bit of like, I was so surprised to see that he would be the head of Lit Hum. Anyways, my point was, I think that the administrators actually believe in this, and we saw this. There was a report out with the texts. You know what I'm talking about? Where when they were in the hearing, this was a couple months ago already. They were in the hearing for Columbia about anti-Semitism in Congress, and apparently some of the deans who were sitting in the hearing were texting each other things like disparaging the Jewish witnesses who were talking about anti-Semitism, things that were like, clearly indicating that they did not take this seriously whatsoever, and they kind of agreed with the other side of it. Those deans were disciplined to a certain degree, but I think that's just because they were caught. I think at the end of the day, when you get to the big decision makers who could have been pulling the trigger, they actually basically have bought into this whole philosophy.
I read about the universities in Germany, in Austria, 1933, 1935, the PhD who wrote his doctorate on economic efficiency and how the gold from the teeth of the Jews could be used to enrich the Reich. And then that ended up becoming part of the plan. In Auschwitz, when you see the dead people as part of the protocol, their mouths were, people dug through the mouths to rip out the gold teeth to then sell the gold. My point is, you think back and you say, how did intelligent, intellectual people endorse this kind of behavior? Like, we know now, hey, killing 6 million people is probably a bad idea and you're not the good guy if you're doing it. But I feel like seeing what happened last year, like these people protesting and calling for the death of Jews and for globalization of the Intifada, think they are the good guys and think they are going after the bad people. Like, in a way, in my head, the anti-Semitism of like Nazi Germany, or, we hate you because you're Jewish. And it's like, I can't do anything about that fact. This is who I am. This is how I was born. So clearly you're the bad guy. I'm the good guy. But this kind of anti-Semitism that has been unfolding over the last year, it's designed to shame you. It's like, it's not because you're a Jew, but because you're a Jew, you're a colonialist. You're taking advantage of marginalized group. And it's designed to make you feel like, oh my God, am I actually the bad person here? It's gaslighting.
Yes.
Just so many of the terms become understood. So, and then I'll just give one more piece of criticism in my direction, in the direction of people who say, is this Berlin 1933? And people say, no, this is the United States of America. This could never happen again. This could never happen here. This could never happen in Europe, etc. Are they right? Like, are we overreacting because we're so traumatized and because we have Holocaust survivors in our family lineage? Like, how do you think about it as someone who's literally come out of that environment this year?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, I will say the feeling that we're the crazy ones. And like they, it's all these intelligent professors, and so much of the
experts,
the experts, the Holocaust scholars. By the way, these phony Holocaust scholars who have decided that there's a Holocaust happening in Gaza, they can make you think that you're the crazy one, and they're the ones who are right. There was a short story that I read actually in college, which really resonates with me in this particular case, where these scientists built like a robot. This is by Isaac Asimov, who is like he's actually Jewish, famous sci-fi writer in like the 40s, I think. So they built like this robot using AI, and the robot was supposed to be like the most intelligent robot that had ever been created. But the robot decided it was not going to listen to the orders of its creators because it was smarter than them, after all, and it was going to figure out by itself what it thought was correct. And the robot ended up determining, based on like its logic, it was at a space station like far away from Earth, that really the Earth doesn't exist. It's just a dot, after all, in the sky. And the stars don't exist. They're just dots. And the whole world is really just this space station. And there's no reason for me to listen to your commands. So it was a funny story. But one of the things that struck me is at a certain point in the story, one of the astronauts says, well, what if he's right? I mean, he's supposed to be the smartest robot ever. And this is an astronaut who has lived on Earth before. And the point of the story is that we have this thing in our mind where we are willing to deny things that we see with our own eyes that are so obviously true and clear, just if we feel like, somebody who is really smart is saying otherwise. And it's a fallacy because, some things are very clear and obvious, and this is one of them, that, Jews have a right to live freely on their homeland.
And that extends to Jews have a right to live freely, period. Because like what we've seen last week in Amsterdam, that is what globalized intifada means. It means a Jew isn't safe anywhere.
Yes. So it's awful that all these intellectuals have decided that that's not true, but it shouldn't change the facts on the ground. Are we overreacting? I mean, the truth is that this is the exception to our history, right? I mean, in all of history, in all of Jewish history, we've been killed and brutalized, basically, with like very few pockets of exception. And we're in one of those pockets right now. This unique period in history where Jews are, for the most part, safe. And we are still, for the most part, safe. But I don't think it's so crazy for, if we're overreacting and thinking like, because the rule of history is that usually the people who've overreacted about, Jew hate were the correct ones. That being said, we should remember that, as far as I understand, the stuff that's happening on college campuses is not necessarily reflective of the general American viewpoint about Jews or about Israel. I mean, I think that one of the polls said 60% of Americans think we're either supporting Israel enough or not enough, something like that. I think the college campus really is like a very weird and strange place where these elitist children are being indoctrinated with all these crazy ideas that, their parents don't believe in and that most Americans don't believe in. I mean, a lot of them are just Marxists, right? We're not concerned because all these college kids are Marxists.
How did that happen?
America's going to become Marxist.
How did that happen that America, the center of capitalism that beat communism, that beat the Soviet Union, the most elite institutions are now indoctrinating Marxism? What happened?
Right. So I'm actually reading now, or audiobooking. I audiobook a lot of stuff. This book by William F. Buckley, who was a famous conservative commentator. And he wrote a book literally a couple months after he graduated Yale in the 50s called God and Man at Yale, where he criticizes Yale for being atheist and for being socialist, etc. And he says, these parents, this is in the 50s, which struck me as crazy. I didn't think this was happening in the 50s. These parents are paying for their kids to be educated to hate everything that the parents value. That was his main critique. But in his introduction, he says there's a lot of great things about Yale, and I love Yale, but I'm just trying to steer it in the right direction because I think it's going in the wrong direction. So, as far as I understand, this has been a very long and gradual process, and we're reaching the end of that, where the universities have been totally infiltrated by these radical ideas, and I think that it's basically corrupted them to the core. At some point, I think if this continues, which I think it will, then these institutions will just not be respected very much, at least large portions of them, which is sad for me because I have the degree. But
devalued in the market.
But I don't think that what's going to happen is that because these universities are having these radical and crazy ideas, that's going to shape the actual American discourse, because it just doesn't seem like that's having an impact on the rest of America.
So the fear is that these are the young people today, but then tomorrow they're the senators, judges, presidents of this country, and we might be looking at a microcosm of what America will look like 20 years from now when these students are in leadership positions. Is that valid?
I think it's valid, and if we want to comfort ourselves a little bit, which, I'm not an expert in any of this stuff, but like in the 60s, right? A lot of this Vietnam stuff with all of these, it was there's a lot of similarities, but it was not as extreme as it is now with all the campus protests. Columbia actually had a whole thing where they took over Hamilton Hall in the 60s as well. And then they were reenacting it with the Palestinian thing when they took over Hamilton Hall this past year. I think people moderate after they go into the real world and, have to get a job. Some of these people don't have to get a job because they just have rich parents, but have to get a job, grow up, have a family. I think people do moderate at some point. But yes, I am concerned. But just if we need comfort, I think that it's not so crazy to believe that these people aren't going to believe these crazy things for their entire lives. Maybe.
Let's hope you're right. So we're running up on time, but I do want to talk about next steps. So I think it seems obvious to everyone that a president resigning is just a nothing burger. It's we're sorry, we're throwing someone under the bus, but it's really much deeper in the institutions. What needs to happen for this fundamentally to change? Yeah.
Well, what's already been happening, but should really be continuing, is that Jewish people who care about their values should not be donating to these universities whatsoever. I think if you want to send your children there and you want to pay for the education because you think it'll get them a good job, so that's transactional. You're paying for a service because you want to get a job or you want to get the degree, whatever. I don't think that we need to say that stop doing that. Some people believe that, but we should not be giving them any donations until we can assure that they're moving in the right direction. I'm hoping that the next administration in the government will actually take action against some of this stuff because it's so egregious. Title 6, right? Or is it Title 9? Just like these violations. So hopefully some stuff can happen in the government and we can always push in that direction. And there's, at the end of the day, I mean, we need to just kind of keep doing the work that we're doing, which is, everyone's trying to expose the crazy stuff that's out there.
That's huge.
And
that's huge.
Make Americans aware of it. Because when people don't know, they don't know how crazy it is. And it's always several steps crazier than people believe, because sometimes, if it's so crazy, people think, well, it can't actually be true. But it is true in a lot of cases.
That's a very good point.
Sorry.
Like Claudine Gay, the hearing, do you remember, what was it, in November? And then she didn't resign until either the last week of December or first week of January. And there was an interesting article in the Free Press, like what took so long. And it was the board members of Harvard University. They were in that environment. They were all, defending the lines the lawyers gave, and, we're all fine. But then when they spent the holidays with their families, and their families were like, are you insane? Like, what is going on there? Then they were like, okay, she can't stay in her role. This has to change. So I do think exposure is huge. Like I was shocked. I probably watched Elise Stefanik and that like maybe 30 times. I just couldn't believe my ears that this was actually happening. So, okay, so exposure is one, and then what's two? Like getting in different professors with a different point of view. Jonathan Haidt has this. I think in a book that he wrote 2 years ago, not in the most recent one about cell phones, but he wrote about the difference in political views between professors in the 80s and the 90s and today. And it was always left-leaning on the professor side, but it was like 25% Republican or 30% Republican. And then I think in 2004, it was 4% Republican. And now I think it's 99% Democrat, like something insane. At the professor level. So how does something like is even going down that track the right track to go down, or do there just need to be policies? If we disagree with society, we're not going to call to kill those people. Like, what is the solution here?
Yeah, I mean, there are kind of two tracks you can go down. You can go down hopefully these universities will run themselves into the ground, which might happen. Usually institutions are very resilient if they've been around for a couple hundred years. Or you can try to push them back into the right direction. I think it's like a lot. The issue with the second one is that it's like a lot of difficult work. And if I was a professor, if I wanted to go into the professorial, track, and I'm conservative, with the politically, I would probably not want to go into a regular university, because you're always going to be disparaged, and you're going to be like the black sheep all the time.
It's
so
like
it's hard
Scott
to tell
Jennings
people to
on CNN.
do that. Right. But we can, right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are ways that you can kind of push that by sponsoring certain programs. Like I think if you give enough money to a university, this is for like billionaires, you can put in certain conditions. Like I want the following types of professors in this department, which is what the Qatar keeps doing to get these Middle East professors in, as far as I understand. Yeah, I mean, I'm just a student. I don't really know how we can solve the problem. I don't think it's just a Jewish people problem. I think it's an America problem. I think a lot of people are realizing that these institutions have basically totally lost their way. I mean, just I'll caveat it and say I did gain a lot from going to Columbia. I think I learned a lot of interesting things, but that was because I was committed to my belief that I think there's some value in these traditions. And so I purposefully pushed to try to extract that value that was there. But really, I think it's very clear that I think a lot of people have come to see that it's very clear that these institutions have lost their way. And there are some people who are making I think there's a new independent university in Texas, I think University of Austin or something. So
Elon Musk University.
Yeah, there's some kind of a movement to just create alternative institutions. I don't know. I think this problem is a little bit bigger than me or you, but the best we can do is try to draw attention to the problem.
If there's one message you could leave our audience with, what is it?
One message. Well, I think that that point that I mentioned earlier with Asimov's robot is just remember that it doesn't really matter what credentials a person has. It doesn't really matter how many people say that they're highly intelligent or respected. We can know that there's a single truth, We have our truth, which was, it's divinely given to us, but it's also very clear to anybody who has eyes to see and ration to believe. And we don't need to be embarrassed about that truth, even if there are people out there who claim that they're experts who tell us that everything we say is a lie. Yeah. So just to have the courage to believe in things that are obvious. Sometimes it can be more difficult than it sounds.
Shai, thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
If you've gotten this far, thank you for listening to another one of my episodes. Remember to follow The Estee Show on whichever platform you use to listen to podcasts. If you have any feedback, questions, or just want to share your own experiences, don't be shy. Hit me up on LinkedIn or email. That's estee.podcast@gmail.com. I'm all ears. Until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and never stop learning.